Well, welcome back to Crosswires. I'm James, and this is the technology show where we look at all sorts of technology, be it new, old, retro, and we look at things from a thoughtful point of view. I have a wonderful guest with me today. I've had the pleasure of exchanging tweets, and in fact, on the old Crosswires podcast, Dan joined us for an episode back there. But, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Wood.
Hey, James. Nice to be back.
Really nice to have you. It feels a little bit odd talking about guests I've had on, like, it's almost like this podcast has regenerated, like, it's Tom Baker. Can't do a good Tom Baker. There you go.
Yeah, it's weird, though, because I had to look back, because I remember we talked about kind of all the different models of the Commodore Amiga last time, didn't we? And I thought that was like maybe 18 months ago. I look back, it's 2018 last time we talked, which is crazy.
Oh, that's insane, isn't it? That's mad. And this time, so you've sort of hinted at what we're going to talk about, which we're going to talk about the Commodore Amiga, which is possibly my favourite retro machine, and it was my first computer. But this time, rather than talking, going through the model list, because look, ultimately there are lots of videos on that, and you've got lots of content on that. I thought, let's talk a little bit more specific. Let's look at how we can potentially use Amigas today and what the options are. So, but before we do that, I should probably get you to introduce yourself to my listeners.
Yeah, well, I'm, I'd say, retro computer fan through and through. And like yourself, the Amiga has always been my favourite platform as well, even though it wasn't my first machine. I mean, when I was a kid, we were always you could say a Commodore household. I had a Commodore Plus 4 was my first machine. I think because my parents got it on a fire sale because it was really cheap for like £25 or something about 4 or 5 years after they got discontinued. My brother had a Commodore 64 though, so I used to play that quite a lot. And then I got an Amiga 500 Plus for Christmas 1991. So that was kind of my introduction to the world of Amiga. And I was one of those weird guys that kind of stuck with the Amiga way too long. I got an Amiga 1200 after that. And I kept using it as my main machine until 2001.
Wow.
Which was a long time. I mean, it was kind of like my mum used to call it Frankenstein's computer because it had no top of the case on. There was cables hanging out of every orifice in the machine and things that were wired in there that shouldn't have been wired into it. So it was definitely, I really pushed that machine beyond its limits. And then I kind of moved on, I got a Windows XP PC, and that was kind of when, I kind of left the Amiga behind a little bit. And then around 2007, I remember there's a guy I used to work for, a guy called Chris Perillo. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He used to be on Tech TV in America.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a television host, and he started doing some live streams. I ended up chatting to him, ended up becoming part of his community and helping him do, some video content and editing and that kind of thing. And then one day I thought, well, actually, he was uploading videos to YouTube, and it's when YouTube first started, and Google Video as well. So I thought I might actually just try putting a camera on and talking about maybe something a bit different. I started thinking about the Amiga again, because around that time I'd managed to get my hands on an Amiga 600, like a good 5 or 6 years after I threw them all in the bin. Yeah, that's my confession. I did actually throw my Amigas in the bin, then bought them all back. So, really that's how it started. I was probably one of the first guys that were making Amiga content on YouTube. I think I uploaded my first videos in 2007. Some of those I've since deleted and put private, but it's always been something I've kind of been known for, covering the Amiga. Even though I'm a big Mac guy these days as well, I do enjoy a good DOS PC. Can appreciate all that era and all retro technology really. I also do my own podcast as well called the Retro Hour that I've been doing for 6 years now, which is kind of like a bit of an audio project to kind of record stories from developers and people that work for gaming companies back in the day. Really, that's our main focus. We always want to hear the stories about the people behind the games and companies that we grew up playing. So that was kind of the aim of that show. So that's really it. I mean, just a guy that loves retro and likes to talk about it as much as possible, really.
Absolutely. And just as a nice tie-in, I think we were talking pre-show. My guest from the last episode, Stu Cambridge, was one of your early guests as well, I believe.
Yeah, he was. And I mean, it was at that stage where, I think I've got a feeling he was in our first 10 episodes or something like that. Just reached out to him on Twitter, we do a podcast, do you want to come on? Straight away, yeah, I'll come on, lovely guy. Had no idea who we were or anything like that, but, starstruck. I was like, my God, he used to, I remember playing him in, Cannon Fodder when I was a kid, Stu's character and stuff. So it was, that was kind of really nice, just how friendly the retro community is, and open to doing stuff like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I had to apologise to Stu for killing him so many times.
Yeah, I think we all did, didn't we?
Yeah, we all killed Stu and Jules. And, and you hit the nail on the head, but the community is so welcoming. I mean, I'm part of, as I said with Stu, I'm part of the RMC retro community.
Yeah.
And you couldn't ask for a nicer bunch of people.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, what Neil's done is incredible. The fact that not only has he built that amazing community, but now, not only online, but physically as well.
Yeah.
And I haven't had a chance to make it down to the cave, since the new one's opened. I know we only had the opening weekend like last week or the week before, didn't they, for the public? So it's definitely on my to-do list over the summer. Get down there finally.
So you've already sort of answered this question, and you have the A500 Plus as your first Amiga. Mine was the 600. Now, I was talking a little bit with Stu about this yesterday, because literally that episode was recorded yesterday. And Stu was saying that Commodore had made some little changes between the 600 and the 500 Plus that actually made it not quite as simple as just a lobbed off 500 Plus.
Interesting. Yeah, because I always assumed it was like, kind of like, today we get the slim models of things, don't we? Like you'll get, the PS3 Slim and stuff like that. So I always kind of assumed it was just kind of that, like technology allowed them to condense it down to fewer parts and cheaper. But I guess, there was stuff in there like it obviously had the onboard hard disk interface, didn't it? And the memory card slot on the side. Yeah. So maybe it was just some kind of nuance like that. They kind of broke things that weren't strictly, system legal. They always had these guidelines they asked developers to stick to that nobody did. Because if you broke the guidelines, you could squeeze way more power out of the chips inside it.
And that brings us kind of nicely on to our first sort of look at how we can use Amigas today, which is going to be original hardware. Now, I have to admit, I looked at prices. I thought, I fancy a 1200. Because I always lusted after the 1200. A friend had one. And it was an AGA chipset with... I think for me, the big draw was because I was a huge Alien Breed fan from Team 17.
Yeah.
And as my uncle allowed me to play Doom when I was probably far too young to play Doom. I don't know if my mum's quite forgiven him for that yet. And I know my uncle will be listening to this, so you are still in trouble, I think, for that one. But Doom, obviously, big, first-person shooter. And on the 1200, they got Alien Breed 3D. And I'm like, I want a 1200 or a CD32.
Yeah.
But I looked at prices and like, nope, I'm not paying that. I A, not paying it, B, can't afford to pay it. But so I guess that's maybe my first question is, what are we looking at right now pricing-wise? And what are some of the risks of buying original hardware?
Well, I'd say, it depends where you get them from, really. I must admit, I don't really buy a lot of... eBay and that kind of thing in terms of Amiga hardware, but I definitely see them around at shows. And I went to the Doncaster gaming market last month. First thing I've been to, after the pandemic. Now everything's kind of reopened over here again, and I saw machines. I like those, boxed CD32s, boxed Amiga 1200s, boxed A600, and they were going for pretty much the price they were new. Again,
wow.
So you're talking about £400. So it's kind of come full circle in that regard. I believe it is still possible to get... actually, a friend of mine found an Amiga 500 that his dad owned, a few months ago, and he's asking me what's that worth. I would have took it off his hands, but I already have 4 of them. Probably couldn't convince the wife that we need another one. So I'd look on eBay, and actually, that they were kind of going for an unboxed example of an Amiga 500 in workable order. That's not too kind of beaten up and everything. Probably around £80 for one of those on eBay. With a power supply and a mouse, and maybe a couple of normally pirated games included in the box with them as well. So it depends kind of what condition you want them in. I'd say if you want something that's going to be comparable to like a mint condition one that's still got a box and everything, you're probably talking pretty close to what they were new. But I'd say, for an old A500, probably about £80, an unboxed example of it. For a 1200, a bit more, probably about £150 unboxed.
And I guess what then, so maybe not so much on the cost side, but on the risk side, because, obviously watching a lot of RMC Retro, watching a lot of your content, there's always that, are the capacitors going to have gone boom?
Yeah, well, that was the thing. You've got to remember these computers were made, at least 30 years ago now. Which makes me feel very old that the Amiga 1200 came out 30 years ago this year, actually, in 92.
Wow.
And they were never designed to last anywhere near that long. We've had engineers, we've had guys like Bill Hurd on our podcast who used to work for Commodore. And he said, they made them and they thought they'd be lucky to last 5 years, let alone people still using them 30, 40 years later. So the components in there were never designed to have that kind of longevity. So there are obviously things in there that, you do want to check. There are certain models of the Amiga, before we get onto capacitors, that had a battery backed up real-time clock
Oh gosh, yeah.
And they would use these old lithium kind of barrel batteries, no, nickel cadmium batteries that were actually in the Amiga. And they have a tendency that after a decade or so to kind of spill their acid guts all over the motherboard, which obviously is not good for ICs and traces and stuff like that that's on the motherboard. So generally, if you're looking on eBay or something, there are certain models to look out for. The Amiga 500 Plus had a battery backed up clock in there. There are certain models of the Amiga 1500 and the 2000 that had them, and not all of them do, depending on how new they are. The Amiga 3000 and 4000 had them in there. 1200 and 600 didn't, and the original 500 didn't either. And the CD32 doesn't either. So, you're kind of safe apart from the capacitors with those. But if you ever see something like, and I see this a lot, on Facebook Marketplace and that, Amiga 500 Plus, untested, generally you can probably pretty much safely assume that they've turned it on and nothing happened. They've got a black screen because the batteries destroyed the machine inside. And then it's kind of, look at the draw, how bad it is really. There are, like you mentioned, a lot of people like, Jan Beta on YouTube. He does a lot of great videos on that kind of thing. Gadget UK. There are techniques for cleaning them up. But again, it depends. You don't really know until you see it, just how bad that corrosion is. And sometimes it can be unsalvageable, really, unfortunately. So that's definitely one thing to look out for. Check if that model of old computer that you're buying came with a battery backed up clock. And, if you get lucky, get it out there ASAP when you get it. Yeah. And then the other thing, like you said, is capacitors. And really, again, there was kind of a thing called the Great Capacitor Plague that really affected, machines from, I'd say, the early 90s to about the mid-2000s, really, particularly with surface mount capacitors. You generally find the older type that was in stuff like, the Amiga 500 and the Commodore 64, the kind of through-hole capacitors, they call them, generally aren't as affected. They can kind of bulge and break, but not as much as the smaller surface mount ones that have a tendency to kind of leak from the bottom. So again, you can get corrosive material that comes out, and there are a load of these all over most of these boards, and they can attack the underlying components. So, and also, you can get some that maybe the components haven't leaked on there, the capacitors are still intact, but you can get weird behavior with them. Like I've just sent my Amiga 1200 off to get recapped by Steve, Retro Passion UK. He's doing mine at the moment. And I only had it recapped about maybe 15 years ago, but it needed doing again. I noticed some weird behavior with it, like it just crashed in weird places. And the audio kind of lost a bit of level on one channel. And, the screen display might not look quite as sharp as it once did. So you can get things like that are generally caused by failing capacitors. So it's always wise, obviously check for the battery backup clock. If you get one of these machines with particularly surface mount capacitors, get them recapped. There are loads of places that do them. You can join a retro forum, and a lot of people that come highly recommended. And I'd say power supplies is another important thing as well, particularly when you're looking at some machines like the Commodore 64 had a notoriously cheaped out power supply, and there are so many stories of them failing and taking the computer down with them as well. Frying the RAM chips and that kind of thing. And again, there are replacement power supplies available, or kits to convert more modern PC power supplies to work with these old machines, which I think, if you don't want your house to catch fire, probably not wise leaving a 30-40-year-old power supply just plugged in unattended. So, no. Yeah. So those are a few things that I always look out for when buying an old machine.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I do remember the A600's power brick being somewhat of a, brick.
Yeah.
I'm sure I stubbed my toe on that as a kid many times. I'm sure
I used to leave mine under the desk and accidentally kick because it had the power switch on the front of the power supply, didn't it? The amount of times I accidentally turned the machine off, in the middle of a game of Monkey Island or something after a 4-hour gaming session.
Oh, no. So, assuming that you've managed to get a good working example of an Amiga in good quality without any issues, these are obviously still going to be the stock machines, and some people might love that experience, but loading games from floppy is slow, to say the least. But what about modern upgrades? What can we do to these Amigas? Because I know there were accelerators back in the day where you could, up the speed, add more, was it chip RAM you could add, and more fast RAM?
Yeah.
But when we look at today, and I know you've done quite a bit of content on this, so what's sort of on the market, and what does that mean for a vintage Amiga? What can you get out of them through these accelerators?
Yes, it really depends on, again, like you said, what you kind of want to run on these machines, and also how, I guess, easy you want the experience to be. I mean, if you buy something like, stock Amiga 500 that generally came with like a megabyte of chip RAM in the, they came with half a meg on board. Normally they all came with a a half meg expansion in the trapdoor underneath it. That was kind of a standard part that everyone had back then. If you buy one of those and you're thinking, well, I want to get software onto it, again, you can use floppies that are slow and unreliable. But there are devices like there's something called a GoTech. That's actually it's a drop-in replacement for a floppy drive, and they're quite cheap. I think I've got about 3 or 4 of them. Generally about £25. And you can get them, people sell them on retro forums, on eBay, and get them off there as well. They've kind of got to be flashed. The firmware's got to be flashed for the machine you want to use it on. So if you want to use it on an Atari ST, you'll get an ST firmware on there. There's a lot of Amiga ones that you'll find on eBay. But then what you do is you literally just open the machine up, take the floppy drive out, plug the GoTech into the same cables that the floppy drive used, and then you can get what are called ADF files, which are essentially images of Amiga games, the disc images, and they're, assuming you own the originals, you are entitled to download them from, the millions of websites you can get them from, to search on Google. And then you can just put them all on a USB stick, and it's got a nice menu launcher on there as well. So that is a way that you can play the games. And, if you've got multi-disc games, there are a couple of little buttons on the GoTech and a little display. So you can just cycle through, like disc 1, disc 2, disc 3. And these are all generally, you can get all packs that are completely set up just to drop on a USB stick and put into a GoTech. So that is probably the cheapest way. If you just want to play these kind of retro games on an Amiga 500 without too much of an outlay, get a GoTech for 25 quid and, a 32 gig USB stick, and you're sorted really in that regard. If you want to make the experience a bit easier, that's where we get into a little bit more expense. And that's when you're using stuff like, I'd say, an Amiga 1200 would be a really good starting point for this. Or an Amiga 600 could do it as well. We mentioned before that those models of the Amiga had onboard IDE hard disk interfaces. So you could actually plug in a hard disk inside the machine when these machines were released. But today there are solutions. For example, you can get IDE to compact flash card adapters. They're very affordable as well. Generally you can get those for under £10 on a place like eBay again. So what you do is the way I do it is generally Compact Flash was it was a card that was really used by digital cameras when they first came around about 20 years ago. A little bit kind of obsolete now in terms of flash storage for most purposes, but you can actually get I go through a few chains. So I use a IDE to Compact Flash adapter that I plug into the Amiga's motherboard, and then I've got a Compact Flash to an SD card adapter that I plug into. So I daisy chain the adapters pretty much. So that means you can use an SD card, which obviously you can pick up at any supermarket. So using that, you can use a system which is called WHD load. Because back in the Amiga's heyday, most games were just shipped on floppy disks. And most of them weren't actually installable to a hard disk, really because it was an anti-piracy measure. They didn't want you, taking your games around your friend's house and installing them on their hard disk. Which I know a lot of PC users did. But now there is a system called WHD Load that actually takes all of these games that were floppy only and will allow them to work on a hard disk. It's a really clever system. So if you've got something like the Compact Flash adapter, you plug it inside the Amiga, load all of these WHD load files onto an SD card, and then you can get menu launchers. So you turn the machine on, and it can literally boot into a list of games that you just go through with your joystick or your cursor keys, press return on a game, and it will load up in like 2 or 3 seconds. That's a really simple way of having everything on there. The only thing is it does require a little bit more memory than the Amiga 1200 came with as standard, for a good experience. You might get some of the smaller games might work okay. But when you get into stuff like, games that required more than like 2 or 3 discs, generally it's going to run out of memory because it has to load them all into RAM first. Mm-hmm. So you're better off getting a cheap RAM expansion. And, places like Amiga Kit or an Amiga retailer or Amiga Store.eu, they sell kind of basic 4 to 8 megabyte upgrades for the Amiga 1200, normally with a modern battery on there, one that's not going to leak, a little coin cell battery, so they can store the time as well. You just plug that into the bottom of the machine. You can get those for about, 60 to 80 pounds, maybe even less these days, actually, because there's a lot of them out there now. And that will give you a good machine for running WHD load on there, having all your games, pretty much every Amiga game ever made, on an SD card inside the machine and launching it from a menu. So that's a really good, if you just want to play the games, those are 2 really good methods to do it.
Awesome. And what about the accelerators? Because, I think one of the first videos of yours I watched was, now I'm going to get this wrong, was the Vampire 2?
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going very high end now.
Okay.
So there are kind of levels below that. I mean, in the 90s, there were some Amiga users would upgrade the CPU to, the Amiga 1200 came with a Motorola 68020 on board. But you could get a higher model called the 68030 or even an 040 or an 060 if you had a lot of money. And people would get cards that had a faster CPU and some more memory on there together. And you could put that in the bottom of the machine. And there are people still making new ones today. There are a lot of 030 cards out there as well, which will give the Amiga 1200 a nice speed boost, probably making it, over a stock machine, maybe even like up to 10 times faster, really. Set some fast RAM and it, makes it 5 times quicker just adding a bit more RAM. So you can really speed up the machine. And for games that, you're not going to see any performance increases in, something like Lemmings, for example. But if you're playing Frontier, which was quite a demanding game, or anything with kind of more demanding 3D graphics, or even some of the racing games. I mean, you play on a stock Amiga 500, something like, Lotus Turbo Challenge 3, you can kind of get a bit of slowdown when there's a lot of cars on screen together and things. So it can smooth out a lot of that kind of thing, make it just a nicer experience. And if you kind of use the Amiga for a bit more than just gaming, if you want to kind of get into the realms of, using retro applications, maybe some of the old 3D packages and that kind of thing, it can generally just gives the whole machine a nice little speed up, really. So I'd say, for me, the sweet spot for a classic Amiga would be an 030 upgrade, which is something readily available. There are new ones being made, now by lots of retailers and community groups. So they're easy to get hold of. If you want to go a bit more high end, you can get an 040, which is generally not really recommended because they could run really warm. And I often found the 040 wasn't as compatible as the 030. A lot of games and stuff failed when I had an 040. But the next one up and the final CPU in that range was the Motorola 68060, which is kind of like, I'd say, Pentium level performance. So they actually came out after the Amiga, commercially ended, but upgrades were made back in the 90s. And today there are, groups who are making new 060 accelerators. There's a guy called Stephen Leary who does the Terrible Fire expansion cards. They don't set your house on fire. That's just a really bad name he's picked for that. Terrible Fire. They're absolutely awesome products. And he open sources them as well, so, people can make their own, which is really cool. He puts all the plans and everything online and how to make them. And there's one I've got called a Warp 1260, which is a new one. It's not actually available yet, but they're hopefully going to be releasing it. There's been a global component shortage that's kind of knocked everything back a little bit. But they're going to be available hopefully in the next 12 months as well. They're not cheap, though. Getting these 060 CPUs now is pretty difficult. So, for something like a Warp 1260, you're probably talking about £800 with the CPU as well. But it also has stuff on there, like it's got upgraded graphics on there, so you can output 1080p. It's got a Wi-Fi chip on there, so you can connect wirelessly to the internet. Way overkill if all you want to do is go on and play a game of, Battle Chess or something. But for those of us who, like to push the Amiga to its limits, those high-end accelerators, are really something else. And, I kind of like them because I always wanted one as a kid.
Yep.
And, now you can finally own an 060 is just, mind-blowing. But then you get into stuff like you mentioned the Vampire, which is like something else entirely, really. There's a technology called FPGA, which, I'm going to get this wrong probably. I think it's Field Programmable Gate Array, it stands for.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. So it's a technology that really allows you. It's kind of like a hardware. I'm going to use the word emulator, and people go crazy when you call it an emulator. It's kind of a malleable chip, if you like, so you can kind of shape it into something else. So you can reprogram the cores on there to basically make this to be a different CPU. So you can flash a core of something like a Motorola 68060 on there. But this team, the Vampire team, have actually gone one step further and kind of made what they're calling the 68080, which is the next level. So they've made their own version of the Motorola CPUs with a lot of modern enhancements and stuff on there as well. And again, it's got stuff like their own graphics core on there too, so you can have high resolution displays, and these things were insanely fast. I mean, the original ones and the one I've got were an expansion for the original Amigas. So the one I've got in the Amiga 600, you literally open the A600's case and it's got a Vampire because you actually sit it over the chip in the Amiga 1200. You push it down over the CPU, and it kind of connects to all the tracks around the edge of it and the traces. And it kind of sucks, the life out of the CPU, takes over it, really. That's why it's called a Vampire. And I think they've got a graphics edition called the Parasites, all that kind of phrasing. But really, you're using the original Amiga's, floppy drive and the outputs on the back of it. But really, I mean, you kind of putting a lot of the Amiga in that FPGA chip.
Yeah.
So, but it does mean that you can go way beyond what the original machine did. I think, the Vampire I've got, the original Amiga 600 runs at 7 megahertz. I think the one with the Vampire runs at about 350 megahertz. So, a very big speed upgrade over the originals. And now they've actually developed it into a standalone machine with the latest revision of it, the Vampire V4. So it's kind of a bit like, like a Raspberry Pi. You can put it in its own case, connect a keyboard and all that. So really getting rid of the bit that was going to slow it down, which is the original Amiga hardware.
Yes.
And you've got all these modern components that are kind of redoing the jobs of the original components in FPGA, but with all the modern benefits as well. So it makes it so much quicker. So if you kind of want to go down that route, again, I mean, they're not quite as expensive as stuff like the Warp 1260s. I think they're going to set you back up from memory. I think it's about £400, I think, for a standalone V4. There's a big waiting queue on them, though. If you want to get hold of one, I think, there's about a 12-month waiting list at the moment. But then you have other things as well. Like recently, over the last 2 years, there's been efforts to make stuff like, I don't know if you've seen, there's an effort which I've completely forgotten the name of it now, and I did a video on it. It's a Raspberry Pi.
Is it a Pi Storm?
That's it, the Pi Storm. So what you do is it's a little connector board that allows you to put one of the smaller Raspberry Pi models without all the USB ports and everything, piggybacked and onto a little board that you push into the Amiga CPU slot. So that means you're using the power of a Raspberry Pi to emulate a faster Amiga, but the original Amiga just sees it as a CPU. So you get a really nice speed upgrade and extra memory and that kind of thing as well. And obviously Raspberry Pis are very cheap. I mean, when I got my Pi Storm back in 2020, I think it was end of 2020, the actual components for the Pi Storm were £15.
Wow.
And I got a Raspberry Pi 3B for about £20 off Amazon. Obviously you need, stuff like an SD card, but that was really the only outlay. So you're getting a really fast accelerator, that it's going to set you back under £50. So that's one project that's been really interesting. And just finally on stuff that's coming out recently, there's also a thing called the Buffy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah.
So this is a brand new accelerator, again using FPGA that's just as small as a chip. Again, you take the Amiga's processor out and you put this in the Amiga slot. But also, I mean, it can work with stuff like the classic Macs, that use 68Ks or potentially even the Mega Drive or the Atari ST. And they're talking, I've got one that is literally, it's in beta at the moment, so it's not running at full performance. But they're claiming that when this is kind of finished, it could run at around 3.2 gigahertz.
Whoa.
So you can imagine, maybe it'd mean things like, watching YouTube on your Amiga's workbench and things could be possible, which just sounds crazy. But, these are just, a lot of these, people will often ask, why on earth would you want to do that? And my answer is always, why not? Just because.
Absolutely. You might even be able to launch one Chrome tab.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, without bringing it to its knees.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, if these are awesome options, and of course, we probably should give an honourable shout out to the Mr. Multisystem. Very cool. I understand again from Stu that they fired up that core for him on Sunday, and he was running Deluxe Paint on an Mr. Multisystem.
Nice. Yeah, I haven't got my hands on one of those yet. I've been talking to Neil, and I know, again, component shortage, but hopefully I'm going to be able to get one off him eventually. But yeah, they look awesome. And again, these are kind of, because they're not just Amigas either, are they? You can put different machine cores on there. I was playing with one at a convention a couple of years ago, and they had I think it was an Acorn Archimedes, core running on there.
Yeah.
I know you can get Atari STs on there and all kinds of different consoles. So again, these are, the FPGA-based things, and you just put different cores on them. And really you've got, perfect simulation of these original machines on, commodity hardware, essentially.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned the E word, which, people really don't like us using in terms of FPGAs, but let's talk emulation. And we were talking about the Raspberry Pi. Now, the Raspberry Pi is a wonderful machine. And, you can run things like RetroPie, which is I'm running a 3B Plus in my lounge with RetroPie. But you did a video last year, I think, on the Pi 400 with, now I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Amibian.
Yeah. I think some people call it, I call it Amibian. Some people call it Amibian. I don't think there's don't actually reveal how you say it, but yeah, your own interpretation's fine.
That works for me. And this, the video looked incredible, but I think the thing that struck me is it just brought back flashbacks of my A600. And in fact, I'll put a link to this in my show notes, turns out Eben Upton, who I think founded the Raspberry Pi Foundation, his first, the first machine he really learnt to program on was an A600.
Yeah, he was a big Amiga fan.
Yeah,
we had him on our podcast probably about 18 months ago, and we really nerded out about the Amiga with him on that one. He's a big fan of it.
Nice. So maybe basically this is effectively, it lets you emulate the Amiga. Now, there is a big caveat to all of this, and I'd imagine for the standalone FPGA stuff, the ROMs and the kickstarts, because amazingly, they're still under copyright. Is it Calanto who still owns all the copyright for the...
I think they own part of it, yeah. Maybe all of it. Honestly, it's one of these where, Commodore, who originally made the Amiga, went bankrupt in 1994. Then there's a German company called Escom who took over and then went bankrupt a year later.
Yep.
And then there was part of that company went to Tulip Computers in the Netherlands, I believe, who made Commodore-branded PCs. Some bits of the Amiga went to Gateway 2000, who were then acquired by Acer, who then subletted it to another group of people. Literally, I think you could have the best legal team in the world and try to trace the history of who owns what about the Amiga, over the last 25 years, and they probably still couldn't do it. Even when Commodore went bankrupt, because they were a really complex company. I remember reading a quote at the time that the reason the bankruptcy dragged out for about a year, just because, again, all these patents and stuff were all over the place. And someone compared it, in complexity to the Maxwell Corporation, that was in the early 90s. So it's always been a legal minefield, which I imagine we'll get onto the latest development in hardware that's going to be in shops soon, which is why it's amazing that actual, new Amiga hardware's even made it onto the shelves. And I imagine that's probably a reason why a lot of things haven't managed to get off the ground, is because you're right. Just so many different people lay claims to different parts of the Amiga.
Yeah. I seem to recall, and I think it's either from your content or from Neil's content, that Commodore UK were actually profitable at the time of bankruptcy of the parent.
Yeah, they kept going. Originally their plan was to buy out the parent company, and they had, David Pleasance, who was the MD of Commodore UK at the time. He wrote a really good book called Commodore: The Inside Story. Disclaimer, I narrated the audiobook version of it, so I was involved in the project, but it's a really good read. And there's a new, it's actually just released kind of what happened after Commodore, 2 new books with Trevor Dickinson. The first volume's out now, called From Vultures to Vampires.
Nice.
So it kind of talks about, the last 25 years of post-Commodore, what happened. So, if you kind of want to get into where all the tangles and stuff, that's a really good place to start. But yeah, really, their plan was to take over the whole Amiga company, but unfortunately,
didn't happen.
I think it was just in terms of investment, it didn't happen in the end. But yeah, they were the only profitable arm. I think Germany may have been as well, but not sure if they were right at the end.
It's really interesting. But a point I was alluding to is there is the open source AROS ROM, but if you want to be able to actually use the original ROMs, you do have to purchase them. And I think you pointed out the cheapest way is actually to get the Amiga Forever, I think basically on the Google Play Store. I think
it's called Amiga Forever Essentials, it's called.
Yeah, and it's ridiculously cheap.
Yeah, I think they're £2 or something.
Yeah.
You get them, or you get all the ROMs for the different types of Amiga on there.
Yeah, and you do need those. And as Dan hinted at earlier, a lot of the games are still in copyright. So, look, I'm not going to tell you don't go and download games, but do you own those games? I might be wrong on this, and I will double check and I'll fact check this myself. I seem to remember Team 17 made all the Amiga games public domain.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, no, they definitely did a few of them. Yeah, I remember Worms Director's Cut and stuff like that. You could download off their website for free.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, and they put the source code out to Alien Breed 3D and things, didn't they? I remember.
Yes, and those. Those was Tower Assault. I have a very vivid memory of getting Tower Assault from a computer shop and actually having to take it back because disc 2 didn't work.
Right. Okay.
As is the case with floppies.
Yeah.
So really cool way to do emulation on a Raspberry Pi, and we'll link to Dan's video in the show notes. But that brings us nicely onto this new hardware that's just come out now. Your video on this is going out probably, half an hour from the time we're recording this?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So this is just like we've had, well, I say just like, we've had things like the C64 Mini, I'm trying to remember, is it the NES Classic and the SNES Classic? And this breed
Mega
of
Drive.
the Mega Drive, not one of the AT-Games Mega Drives, an actual...
No. Proper Sega one.
Yeah, proper Sega one, yeah. We've had these machines, and there's this real nostalgia at the moment for retro tech. So the A500 Mini, Dan, tell us about it, because you've got one.
Yeah, well, actually, I know this is an audio-only podcast, but there you go, in my hand right now.
Nice tap.
Give you a little indication of how solid it is. Yeah, this is, and again, like we were talking about before, because there have been so many legal tanglings in the world of Amiga and copyright chaos and, a legal minefield trying to get anything done. I remember seeing, there's a Commodore 64 joystick. It was kind of a joystick that you plugged into your TV with a load of Commodore 64 games on for the C64 that came out in around 2004. I remember back then thinking, it'd be great if, why didn't they put an Amiga on, an Amiga one of those out, put Sensible Soccer on it, whatever. They sell loads of them. And I remember at the time, people were like, well, because everyone owns different parts of it, no one can agree on it. I remember thinking, what a waste. But now finally, and I know I've spoke to the guys at Retro Games Limited, it has been difficult for them, but they managed to do it. And I think that's probably, part of the delay, because it was originally rumored to come out last year. And again, component shortage, I imagine. But they finally managed to get, an officially licensed, I'm going to call this the A500 because there is no Amiga or Commodore branding on it. You don't see the word Amiga anywhere on here. But it looks like, if you can imagine, a Amiga 500 shrunk down to maybe the size of a large, iPhone or something. It's about that size, really. Nice little modern recreation, modern hardware. Got all the ports that you'd expect to find today. You got HDMI output, plug it into your modern TV. It's powered by a USB-C charge, like a phone charger, pretty much. You got 3 USB ports on the back of it, and that's it. There's a fake keyboard that's purely for aesthetic reasons, which bizarrely I've seen so many people on forums going, well, I'm not buying one if the keyboard's not real. But you need the keys are tiny on this thing. You need like a cocktail stick to press the keys in. I couldn't see that ever working. It is a mini machine. But obviously you can plug a USB keyboard into it if you need one. A fake floppy drive on the side, that, again, for aesthetic reasons. But it looks like a tiny, cute little Amiga 500. Very sweet looking thing. I mean, when I first opened it, that was my reaction on the video. And you'll see it if people watch my video. I went, oh, because it just looks really cute. It is a properly licensed Amiga A500 that you're going to be able to walk into, Game and high street retailers, Argos, and be able to buy an Amiga again in 2022, which is the first time I can remember that happening since the mid-90s, which is crazy.
And it's fantastic. I've seen some sort of images of it already. Does it? Am I mistaken? Does it come with a mouse and a CD32-like joypad?
Yeah. So you've got... So if anyone remembers the original Amiga mouse, it was called affectionately, or maybe unaffectionately, because I don't remember anyone who actually liked that mouse back then.
No.
It was called the tank mouse, it was called, wasn't it?
Yes.
Very boxy looking thing, which weirdly there seems to be a load of nostalgia for it now. I've seen people, begging them to release a mouse standalone so they can use it on the PC, and I think they are. And there's actually a Kickstarter running. Someone else is making new Amiga tank mice with a kind of touch-sensitive scroll wheel in the middle of it as well that you can use on a modern PC or a Mac. I always hated this thing when I was a kid. First thing I did when I got an Amiga was replace it with a better mouse, but that's just me.
Was it Logic Free or...
Speed Mouse. Yes. That's what I used to replace. Yeah, I've got about 4 of them. Yeah, my collection still. They're always the ones I bought.
Now, the question I have about this mouse, of course, is it optical? Is it still a good old-fashioned...
No, it is optical, yes. You've got you don't have to clean the ball on it or anything like that anymore. And it's a bit smaller than the original as well. I'd say about 3/4 of the size.
Okay.
Which actually, because I've been using this one, I've been playing around with it over the weekend, and the buttons are near that micro switched.
Ooh,
whereas the original, I know there are a few different revisions of the original Amiga tank mice. Most of the ones I've got had those kind of sellotape leaf switches underneath, that really wore out over time. They were very cheaply made. This feels a lot nicer. And I've got to say, the size of it as well, I've actually found it quite comfortable. I think, if the original Amiga mouse was like, quarter the size smaller, it probably would have been nicer in the hand. So I've actually quite enjoyed using it, which I never thought I'd say about the tank mouse. So you get that with it. And also, you get like, you could say a much improved CD32 style controller, which again, I've got here. And I'd say in terms of, the original Amiga CD32 controller, I always thought was just slightly a bit too long. the middle section of it just felt a bit awkwardly spaced out, and you had it wasn't even really a D-pad, it was like a disc on the CD32 controller that would always break, and it had a couple of kind of raised little dots on it, and it was terrible to use. And you had this kind of mushy rubber button in the middle as well for pausing games. They've improved all that, and you've got a proper D-pad that feels nice and clicky. The action buttons on that, feel very much like a Super Nintendo pad in terms of the 5 buttons on there. And you have a menu and home button in the middle section, and then you got 2 nice clicky shoulder buttons on it as well. And again, they've really done the homework on this, and I think really worked on the ergonomics of it. And it's, 'cause I'll be honest, I'm more of a joystick guy when I play Amiga games. When I was a kid, I've still got them now. It was always the zip sticks.
Oh, yes.
They're what I use. Always loved the zip stick. And, if I'm playing my A1200, I've got a zip stick plugged in, or there's some more modern joysticks. Like I've got an Arcadia, which is kind of like a Competition Pro, like an old 80s joystick, modernized with kind of arcade clicky parts and stuff in it. So it feels nice. So generally, I normally play my Amiga games with a stick, but I think I'm probably in the minority. I know that most modern gamers prefer a pad. So I think it was a good choice of them to include a joypad with it. But one thing that always threw me when using a pad on Amiga games were, particularly platformer games, you always had to press up on the joystick to jump.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, which, if you're using a stick, that's all right, but on a pad, it's quite fiddly to do. But luckily, every game that you run on here, the games that are included with it, they've actually remapped them all, so jump is a button.
Oh, perfect.
And then you can put your own games on it. You can put a USB stick in there with your own games, providing you legally own them, as we said before. And there is a function to remap each game, on a per-game basis. So you can remap the controls, and it saves them in memory.
Fantastic. And I take are these just ADF files that people are putting onto a stick?
No, it can't launch ADF files at the moment. It uses that WHD load we were talking about.
Oh, okay.
So that's the only way for now. So you've got to download the WHD load files, and again, there are websites that just have them all pre-made. Put that in, it will read them. They've actually got a full catalogue of settings files already made for pretty much every game on there.
Fantastic.
So really, you should just put the stick in that you'll just be able to launch it then. I've heard that ADF support could be coming in a future update because they actually do, they can do firmware upgrades on this.
Of course,
so you just you get it off their website, put it on a USB stick, and you can upgrade the firmware. So hopefully that is something they're going to be doing at some stage. But for now, it's WHD load only. But you can pretty much get any Amiga game on WHD load format.
Yeah. And I think you've answered, because I think, is it 25 games it comes with?
Yeah, quite a selection as well, actually. A lot of the ones I liked when I was a kid, I loved Pinball Dreams.
Yes.
That's on there as well, which, and most people think Pinball Fantasies was a better game, and it probably was, but Dreams was the one that I probably spent most time with when I was a kid, so it was quite nice to see that one on there. And again, they've done some, like I said, the controller remap, because you remember, if you played the original, you had to use the shift keys on the Amiga's keyboard.
Yes. Yeah.
You had to do the bumpers, get all the flippers. And then there was a version on the original Amiga console that Commodore made, the CD32, that had a really weird control scheme. To use a left flipper, you had to press left on the D-pad, and then for the right one, you had to press the right shoulder button. It was really weird design. But they fixed all that now. Obviously, the flippers are just the 2 shoulder buttons on the controller. So, a lot of the stuff like that they've improved. And there's Chaos Engine, that was another game that I loved as well. And to select your bombs and that, they put that on the B button rather than having to tap the space bar on the Amiga like you used to.
Makes sense, yeah.
And got Zool on there. That was a good platformer game. They often called the Sonic the Hedgehog Killer in all the Amiga magazines, which of course he wasn't, but for Amiga fans we liked him. Worms: A Director's Cut, which actually a lot of people reckon is probably the pinnacle of 2D Worms.
Yes, I would agree with that, absolutely.
But it reached a very limited audience because it came out in 1997.
So well after Commodore went bankrupt, well after you could buy an Amiga, and it was people like yourself who were really keeping that going. I can't remember exactly when we got rid of our 600, and if I could go back in time now and stop my father, Dad, if you're listening, yeah. Because I remember actually going round to the guy. So he sold it to someone from work, and I went round to help him set it up. And
heartbreaking!
No, but of course at the time I'm like, we're getting a PC, we're getting Star Wars Rebel Assault. Looking back at it now, I'm like, oh, what have I done? But
well, at least you sold yours. I threw mine in the bin.
Yeah, we need to have a talk about that offline. I think we need to get. Yeah. I think the Council of Retro Computing needs to deal with you, my friend.
I'm not proud.
Good. So I guess my final question on the A500 Mini, without taking too much away from your video, is: can it run Workbench?
Not officially, but yes.
Oh, okay.
I got it working. In my video, actually, you can see me getting it working.
There we go. So go and watch Dan's video, because honestly,
it wasn't easy, but I got it working.
I can imagine. I will say this, and I'm not just saying this because you're on my show, but every time I've watched your Amiga content, I've come away learning something, and it's always been brilliant. So thank you for all that you post. And of course, I guess that leads us on to, we've been talking about games, and we've been talking about software. So I guess to wrap things up, if you had, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit here, if you had to choose, I might let you have two picks. I might let you have a game and a piece of software.
Oh,
I might be generous. Do you know what? I'll let you either have two games or a game and a software. I'll be nice.
You know what? We did this on I do a patrons only podcast for patrons of our show. Where we picked our top 5 Amiga games. I can't remember what I picked now. I think it changes by the day. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, if you're talking kind of non-Amiga exclusive games, stuff I used to play as a kid, except I know it was out on other platforms as well, I'd say Monkey Island 2.
Yes.
To me, that was something that really strong memories. And, I've never been someone who completes a lot of games, probably because I'm not very good at them normally, but that game was, I just remember Monkey Island 1 and 2, playing them from start to finish, even without, a solution or anything. Today you can get walkthroughs, can't you? Yeah. But my brother and I, we spent hours on those games, just figuring out every little puzzle and every little way through them. So I think, that would have to be definitely up there. If you let me pick another game, I say Another World as well. Another World, I used to absolutely adore that game. And again, it was kind of one of the first kind of cinematic video games that I played, and just loads of atmosphere and a great story in there as well. That's actually on the A500 Mini.
Oh, fantastic.
So, I spent, probably why my video was a bit late. I spent about 4 hours playing that the other day. So in terms of serious software on the Amiga, see that again, I mean, it kind of depends whether stuff like Wordworth, which was a word processor that I used, did all my college work on, Wordworth 7. Very good, but I probably wouldn't use it today. But, for its time, I thought it was really good. In terms of stuff I use on there now, I use, there's a web browser on there called iBrowse. That's actually still in development today. New version only came out about a year ago. Can only do basic browsing and stuff like that, but that was actually the first web browser that I used on my Amiga back in the mid-90s. It got me online. So, that's kind of been something that, is kind of always in my my arsenal of, programs that I like to have on an Amiga. And Directory Opus 4 as well.
Now, that's a Workbench replacement, isn't it, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, just makes copying files around and, file manipulation and management so much easier than using Workbench. So again, I've got that on every Amiga. I've even put that on the A500 Mini on my Workbench on there, just because it makes life so much easier. So yeah, Opus 4 would definitely be, one that I use still today as well, if you want something a bit more relevant.
I like that. And of course, we all had a copy, ironically, a pirated copy of Xcopy.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that I only learned recently that was actually a commercial product. I didn't know anyone that actually bought it. Kind of shot themselves in the foot there, that you could actually copy Xcopy with Xcopy.
There's a bit of a meta thing going on. Yeah. I mean, look, I will confess my sins. I did have purchased Amiga games, absolutely, birthdays, but my school was just like this trading ground of Amiga discs.
Yeah, I think we all were.
Yeah. Naughty. I mean, it shouldn't really say this. I had to do. I'd never. I need to double check whether or not I'd actually bought cannon fodder. I think I'd.
Of course you did.
Of course I did. Yeah, absolutely.
I've done that. I spoke to developers of games that I pirated when I was a kid. I've actually told them after, and I'm so sorry. What game are you working on now? I'll buy it. When it comes.
Please don't. Yeah. To be honest, I don't. There's a difference between maybe having pirated copies from your mates and going to the car boot sale with your thousands of floppy disks.
Those are the ones that really harm the industry, I think. And, I've talked to people that run software companies back then. They were like, playground piracy, or we couldn't advocate it, but you're right. It was at the market stall traders that were selling them every weekend. And it was, the pirate bulletin boards that really, hammered the nail in the coffin for a lot of them.
And it's where, unfortunately, we ended up the need for some of this insane copy protection that we ended up with, which... I can't remember exactly which game, but I do remember some of the copy protection systems being so bad that I couldn't, as someone who does struggle with her eyesight, I couldn't read the copy protection, so I had to get my mum to do it for me.
And then someone who pirated the game didn't have to put up with any of that. They were straight in gaming with it. So he punished the people that bought it, which is a really weird twist of fate. And stuff like lens lock. I remember that horrific thing. That was, who thought that was a good idea?
That was just, gosh. So, I mean, I would say, I'm really torn on this. The game that probably holds the most memories for me is probably Worms, because the amount of fun I had having friends round or just a bunch of friends and doing turn-based Worms as like an after-school thing.
And it's still fun today, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I have it on the RetroPie, and I took it back up to my parents, and me and my mum spent hours just playing Worms. It was very surreal playing Worms on this 50-odd inch LG TV.
Yeah.
Like, okay. So, and then of course, being a little bit creative, obviously doing all this podcast stuff, Deluxe Paint.
Yeah.
What a program. I was thinking about this yesterday. I was talking with Stu, and I remember doing a thing in Deluxe Paint, doing a train for some transport homework I had. And I don't think I got a very good grade for it. Because, of course, all my classmates in year 7 and I think like into year 8 were all on PCs. And they got all the clip art. Now, me, I'm in D-Paint and Wordsworth,
Making your own.
Absolutely. So,
see, I love D-Paint as well. I was never any good at it, though. Yeah, and we used to, at Christmas, I remember, it always came with the Amiga, didn't it, D-Paint? Everyone had a copy of it, and I remember making, I think you could only fit 10 frames of animation into 1 megabyte of RAM, but just drawing stickmen and stupid things. I had loads of fun with it. I was just never any good at art, really, unfortunately. But, yeah, I can see it, definitely, if you're naming, legendary Amiga programs. I
think I remember doing, when you could cycle the color palette to make, gradients. Animated gradients. I'm going to really show my nerdiness. I remember doing my best sketch of the USS Enterprise with glowing warp nacelles. I was
hit the tab key and it warped then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That was cool.
Awesome. So listen, Dan, thank you ever so much for joining us. Where can people find your content?
Yeah, so my podcast, that comes out every week, every Friday, which was, an idea that I had 6 years ago, doing a guest-based interview every single Friday. Seemed a good idea at the time. We've managed to keep it up for 6 years, amazingly. That's just search the Retro Hour on your favourite podcast app, or we have a website, theretrohour.com. On YouTube, search Dan Wood. I'm normally come up first on there, or Dan Wood Amiga. You'll find me then if you're interested in the Amiga stuff.
And of course, I'll put links to both Dan's YouTube channel and the podcast into the show notes. It's been an absolute pleasure, Dan. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate we've gone a little bit longer than I'd sort of planned in our session, but I don't know what it is about retro, and particularly the Amiga, you can just talk about it without thinking about time.
What do I say? Time flies when you're having fun.
Oh, absolutely. So thank you, everyone. You can find my show notes with all the links for our discussion today at crosswires.net. Check out our YouTube videos at crosswires.net/YouTube. Make sure you subscribe in, as Dan said, your favourite podcast app. And check out a blog as well at crosswires.net, because we've got some great stuff going on there. And thank you ever so much. Oh, if you have any questions or feedback, I forgot to mention in the last episode, you can email podcast@crosswires.net.